You know that pragmatism, American pragmatism, for example, was practically dead by the end of the 40s and beginning of the 1950s.
Interest in Dewey was the absolute nadir in America. I mean, it was nobody was reading Dewey, except for some old, former students. It was considered completely passé.
We look back and we see these what we take to be high points. We see James, Dewey, Peirce, Royce, and so forth, Emerson, maybe, Thoreau, maybe. But we forget at the time, say, particularly in the 30s, these thinkers were being eclipsed by the latest stuff from the continent. The Vienna Circle, Wiener Kreis, the whole positivist movement.
And it just happened to be revived in the 70s and 80s, I think because of a local and very small quarrel between two American philosophers who were still alive and practicing, one Hilary Putnam.
I'm Hilary Putnam.
And the other Richard Rorty.
Richard Rorty is a pragmatist in the sense of being a neo-pragmatist. And neo-pragmatism in this sense is a movement which has been very heavily influenced by French literary criticism, more specifically work of Jacques Derrida.
So when he says we should stop talking about reality in the world and truth and all those categories, it's a clearer statement that anything that any statement could be of the postmodern mood. So I think he captured that extremely well, and he formulated it extremely clearly.
The idea here is that you never really get down to a point where you can say this is a point at which we can stand or which we can be successful in terms of operation, because there's an infinite reinterpretability called for. Now, I think this is a very important point in the analysis of literature. But in terms of, say, the philosophy of technology, in terms of inquiry into the sciences, and in fact, in terms of everyday life, we do have certain platforms on which we can stand. They're not ultimate, they're not foundations. We do have certain platforms on which we can stand to be able to build further platforms. And to say that, for instance, there needs to be infinite reinterpretability of the Golden Gate Bridge, I think is wrong. The fact is that technical artifacts have a certain kind of warrant, and they have a certain kind of assertability that goes beyond the kind of claim that's being made, or the kind of claims that are being made by those who accept those strands of French postmodernism into pragmatism, thus making neo-pragmatism.
I would prefer just being called a pragmatist instead of a neo-pragmatist.
Putnam, for example, he spent a lot of time with Dewey recently, but even prior to that, there's a way in which we might want to include some of his work in this pragmatic tradition, just because of the way it's carried out, the spirit of how it's carried out.
What people call neo-pragmatism in my stuff and in Hilary Putnam's stuff, for example, is linguistified pragmatism.
I don't call myself a pragmatist. For one thing, I don't like the pragmatist theory of truth, which they were too proud of.
Yes, the quarrel between Rorty and Putnam is really intriguing. Both of them became stars of a certain kind, representing opposite points of view. Putnam represents the pole of thinking which says we're making slow progress toward some kind of a valid and adequate picture of all the philosophical questions. The classic questions are still with us. We're still working at it. There have been a lot of false starts, but we are making progress.
Every philosopher feels, and this is to the credit of analytic philosophy, that if analytic philosophy didn't live up to this great dream that the new science, or the new science plus the new logic, a dream that Russell very much felt, for example, in the pre-World War I period, if that dream that philosophy, that the new science and the new logic would solve philosophical problems, didn't pan out, nevertheless, we learn more about why and how difficult they are and why they're so difficult. And that is maybe the lasting philosophical progress. We have a deeper insight into the issues, and also we have more possibilities which we have to sort out.
And Rorty says, nonsense. The game is over. The older conventional view that we could answer the questions that classic philosophy had posed is just a kind of self-deception. Philosophy in that sense is over.
Well, one of the people who's made that claim, at least implicitly, is Richard Rorty. That philosophy is a kind of literature, that science is a kind of literature. His more explicit claim is that science is a kind of literature, but by extension, I think it's clear that he regards philosophy as a kind of literature. And in fact, there's no question that he does privilege literature over inquiry into the sciences.
When people ask what philosophy is good for, I don't think one can do anything except say philosophy is the following series of books, starting with Plato and coming on down, all those things that Whitehead called footnotes to Plato. These books have influenced the way human beings have thought of themselves, the way they've organized themselves into social groups in various ways. The people who are writing footnotes to footnotes to footnotes to Plato are making suggestions about how we might think of ourselves, how we might organize society. But of course, so are all the other intellectuals. They're making the same sorts of suggestions. Philosophy is just suggestions of this sort made by people who have read certain books as opposed to the suggestions made by people who have read other sets of books.
The idea that philosophy is a science which would finally answer the question of knowledge, the question of reality, the question of moral values, all things of that kind, that's all gone. Now then, Putnam said of Rorty, look, you're a spoiler, you're an anarchist, you're a nihilist, or, and here's the last dirty word of the bunch, you're a relativist.
Again, Rorty says, and this he doesn't deny having said, in fact that's in print, that as far as I'm concerned, the notion of warrant, justification, is a sociological notion. None of the classical pragmatists was a cultural relativist about warrant. And Rorty is an explicit cultural relativist about warrant and a skeptic about truth.
And Rorty says of Putnam, no, my friend, you're the relativist. I could have been, but I was clever enough to see that relativism is an untenable position, and I didn't ever commit myself to a view which would have justified what you now say. Now, it seems to me that both Putnam and Rorty were right about the other, but not right about themselves. Okay? And that in the exchange between them, between Rorty and Putnam, it became clear that both of them were pragmatists of a sort, and that they realized that if pragmatism was going to have another inning, it would have to be on the condition that pragmatism would not be as smug as it had been in the past and would reach out to reinterpret the rest of the Eurocentric tradition more fruitfully than it ever had before in order to recover the strongest possibilities of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy, and therefore enrich pragmatism in a new way.
Yeah, he did an important job in getting people to read the pragmatists again. He was influential in getting me to read James and to start teaching James. So I'm grateful to him for having called attention to classical pragmatism. But he's read everything, but he has a philosophy of his own, Rortianism is a good enough name. He doesn't call it pragmatism.